Thanks for tuning in to the 168 Podcast, a podcast from Mitchell Knight and Jordan Byrd of the Clarence Church of Christ, aimed at helping you connect Sunday worship with everyday life.
What is the most important element in a young person coming to faith in Jesus? That is the question we're going to look at today in this episode of the 168 Podcast. I'm Jordan. This is Mitch. Welcome. How does a kid come to faith in Jesus? There's lots of factors that go into that, but one recent article that I read, discipleship.org, that Bobby Harrington wrote, at least in a recent email that I got, but there's also a link that we'll try to put to this article in the notes for this show. But one thing that he addresses, or I guess I'll just start with how he begins the article, because I think he raises a good point in thinking about what is one of the most crucial elements to helping a young person come to faith in Jesus. And he says, the clearest exposition on disciple making is the one given by Moses to parents when the nation of Israel was established in the Sinai desert. As the people came out of Egypt, God's plan was that parents would obsessively, yes, more on this word below, disciple their children, and it would be the primary means by which the faith of Israel would be passed on from generation to generation. And so the text he's talking about here is Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9, which is typically or historically known as the Shema. And he breaks it up into three distinct parts. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on for this topic, just looking at the three distinct points that he lays out in this article, and then kind of giving our summarizing thoughts toward the end. The first thing he mentions, or I guess first let me read the first part of the Shema. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4 says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So the first thing that Bobby Harrington notes in this article is that parents acknowledge God's kingship or sovereignty.
You serve one God and only one.
Yeah, what do you think about that point?
Well, that's on display in our lifestyles. So, idolatry is really anything that comes before God that's worshipped as God. And nowadays in our culture, especially in America, we have that temptation a lot. It could be technology, it could be, retail therapy and spending a bunch of money. It could be making money, it could be your job or your career. You're basically serving some kind of God. But as it said here in Deuteronomy, our Lord is one. We have one God, and the only thing we should serve is our Father in heaven. So that's what I think about that.
Yeah, we probably should back up a little bit and just note that the drive of this article is revolving around parents and how the Shema for Israelites in the Old Testament part of the Bible, at least in their way of life, the faith of Israel was passed on primarily through the parents. And so that's why he's saying in this first point, parents are to acknowledge God's kingship or sovereignty. And so then he, referencing the Shema or in Deuteronomy 6:4, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So in Deuteronomy, it's saying like parents, for your children to know that the Lord you follow, the one who delivered you out of Egypt, for them to realize that because you no longer are in Egypt. Your kids didn't see you cross out of Egypt through the Red Sea. They didn't get to experience that. So for them to know who this God is that has performed this wondrous thing for you, who has delivered you from your oppressors, it's on you to pass that down. They know it by you recognizing who God is and them seeing that you recognize who God is in that way. And so I just want to emphasize, like, that's the drive of this article, is that parents have the primary influence in making any of the points that are in this article known. And so when it comes to God's kingship or sovereignty being made known, that's primarily going to come through a kid's parents, because they spend the most time with them on average throughout a week. We can think often that it's media or TV or this influencer or that influencer, and while that may be a lot of time that a young person spends with in the sphere of influence of that person or those people, overwhelmingly a child is with their mom or dad most likely of all the hours in a week with them primarily. And so when it comes to who they see the most and what kind of life they see lived out the most, it's primarily going to be the adults in their life, which doesn't necessarily have to mean it has to stop with the parents. It could also be the other adults in a young person's life. It just means that those adults, if they don't live with the kid, they're not going to have the same amount of hours accumulated to do that. They're just not in that adult's presence that often. But parents, by and large, have that kind of influence just by the sheer fact that you live under the same roof and that you see each other more hours of the day than not. A few years ago, I had encountered a guy named Roger Nishioka, I think is his name, and he gave a lecture at, I think it was Princeton. They have like a youth ministry like seminar thing they do, I think, most years. And part of his talk was talking about how young people forge community together. And one of the things that he notes from the research he did or that he researched and found was that it takes at least 17 contiguous, I think that means like continual. I'm remembering my terminology right. It's not a word I use all the time, contiguous. But if it requires 17 contiguous hours of people being together before community is formed. And so his point in saying this in the context of youth ministry was, if you're banking on an hour on a Sunday night or a Wednesday night for a youth group, to do that, it's going to fall short most of the time, because say if you have a group of 5 students that meet together for that 1 hour, 1 week, but then the next week, 2 of them aren't there, but say 2 others visit, his point is you're starting over, because now it's a different group of people. It's a different experience because it's different people sharing that time together. Whereas he's saying if you could have 17 contiguous hours of the same people sharing an experience together, that's what helps shape and form community. So he points to things, and we probably all realize this just from our own general experience. If you've ever gone on a road trip with a group of people, that experience lives on because you all experience it in this like long drawn out time that you spend together, because you're with each other like nonstop. And so the experience forges you together that other people don't get to have with you. And so that's one easy way to do that, like retreats or conferences where you go away for like a week, where you get away from your surroundings and you spend constant time with other people. That helps forge community. So my whole point in saying that is, where do we do that naturally all the time? Well, when we're younger, we are constantly with our parents. That cycle never stops, and it just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. So who do you naturally look to? You look to your parents. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that that's where the emphasis comes for all these other points. And we're not going to spend as much time on the next 2, but that's kind of the driving force behind them. The article goes on to continue, quoting the rest of the next part of the Shema, Deuteronomy 6, verses 5 through 6, where it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts." Jesus, we were talking about this before we started recording, that Jesus quotes something similar when he talks about the importance of loving the Lord your God, which is like your whole being. And so part of the point that Bobby Harrington makes in this article is that parents, in order to pass on the faith to your kids, you have to personally devote yourself to God daily with your entire being. What do you take from that point? Like, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's easy for us to put our faith on display, like as Jesus warned, as the hypocrites do, to be recognized, to receive appreciation. But what you're talking about is the fact that there's no hiding, from our children. Our children get to see us behind closed doors, right? So our faith has to be on display in an authentic way, how we live, how we seek after Him, how we learn, because kids will latch onto that. And I think you see so much about this in the Old Testament when God says, He initiates the celebration of the Passover, and it's like, well, when your children ask you about this, you tell them, well, this is because the Lord our God passed over us when He delivered us out of the hands of the evil Egypt. But that question comes from, like, why are you doing this, to the point where it's like a natural rhythm in your life, that you're living out your faith, that you're truly loving God more than just with lip service, but with your very being. And I mean, I think people latch onto that. That's the most influential thing we have, is leading by example. So,
Yeah, I mean, it really just comes down to what you actually invest yourself in as a parent is what you're going to, I mean, your kids are going to notice that that's what's important to you, and they're going to want to, I mean, the reason they do a lot of things they do now, I mean, I see this even with my own kids, like they think things are cool because I like to do them, whether they actually know that to be the case or not. Like if I gave them a choice, they almost don't know differently because that's what they see me do. So, I mean, just case in point, this last Sunday, we're watching the Bills game. Like, my son only cares about the Bills, one, because we live here, but two, because I'm investing in time to watch it. Otherwise, he probably would care less. But it's because he sees what I'm doing that he has an interest in as well, even though he really has no idea what's going on. And so I think the same is just as true, if not all the more true, when it comes to our faith and the realities of the things that we think are the most important or truthful in our life, which is God and what he has revealed to us about how life is to be lived and how we can live it to the fullest. And so the point kind of comes down to, like, if as a parent, all you're doing is saying, like, this is important, you should go do it, but your kids don't see you actually doing that, you're almost wasting your time, because they're not going to see it as being as important if you're not even willing to invest yourself in it. So yeah, I think that's kind of the overall point there. All right, so the last point, this comes from the rest of the Shema, which is Deuteronomy 6 verses 7 through 9. Impress them, so that's talking about the commandments of God. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. And so the third point that Bobby Harrington takes away from that part of the Shema is for parents to intentionally or obsessively, if you will, teach God's commands to their children. So the idea of it's intentional, but like it's more than just like a habit. It's like it's what your day or your life revolves around, like helping them realize these commands. It's not just an add-on thing to your life, but like it's very centered.
right.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that point?
Well, it goes back to what I mentioned earlier about how, it's more than just lip service. Well, I mean, lip service is part of it. I mean, you have to talk about these things with your kids and talk about these things with the people you want to influence constantly. But your support for why they should listen is based on the authentic nature of you actually living it out. If you are living it out, then there's power behind your words and your instructions. So that's just what I think about how everything flows from what we've said.
Yeah. Harrington finishes this part of his article by saying he personally calls Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, or the Shema, the Great Commission, or referring to when Jesus tells his disciples sort of his final, like, this is what I hope you will do once I depart from your presence. We see the Great Commission that Jesus gives to his disciples in Matthew 28, 18 through 20. But Harrington sees the Shema as like the Great Commission before the Great Commission. And his whole point here is, truth be told, in history, most conversions happened in the home. For example, most estimates are that in the last 100 years, about 80% of all people who came to Christ in North America did so before they were 14 years of age. And I don't know where he's drawn that data from necessarily, but I have pretty frequently over my adult life heard similar statistics of the closer you get to adulthood, basically, if you haven't decided what side of the fence you are on when it comes to who God is, following Jesus, that whole dynamic, your chances are dropping more and more and more rapidly that you're not going to even care about who God is or to follow Jesus. It's not to say it can't, which I would say is probably even your own life story of how you came to follow Jesus. And you can say more about that if you want to. But I do think it's very true that like what you at least see is that the parallels, once kids reach the age where they're about to depart from their parents, that opportunity seems to go down, which the correlating factor there seems to be like, what changed? Well, they're no longer with their parents. And they can be around you all the time, but if it's not focused on following Jesus, it's not going to matter for this anyway. That's why it matters if you're following Jesus and how you are following that in front of your kids, and not just in a like to just make the point, but like you sincerely actually are following Jesus and it's important to you. So yeah, I think that statistic is fairly true, just from at least my anecdotal, like looking at life and just the things I've read and heard and experienced. What do you think about his follow-up point there?
Could you remind me of what it is? For some reason, I'm blanking.
Where he calls the Shema kind of the Great Commission of the Old Testament, and just the whole idea that historically a lot more people
are converted in the home.
Were converted in the home, yeah.
Right, yeah. So I would just tag on with Jordan then and say that it's similar nowadays. I mean, you can go door to door and hand out pamphlets, but it's like, I mean, think about how many times Jehovah's Witnesses have talked to you. Have you converted? Probably not, because it's more of a sales pitch rather than the influence of actually living life around you in a way that's meaningful and impactful. So, I mean, I think a lot of, how we live out our Great Commission from Christ can come from the Shema in terms of actually forge relationships and, build bridges, not just type up pamphlets. So,
yeah, I think some of it's just the living within the culture of a community. I mean, just at least the one example that pops in my head, but just thinking about the Bills again, like before living here in Western New York, like I knew of the Bills, but it's not like it's something I gave much thought or time toward. But living within the culture here, it's hard to not care about that just because that's what the area cares about. Because what am I surrounded by all the time? I hear about it all the time. I see it at the grocery store. I hear it on the radio. I see it on advertisements. Like it's everywhere. That the more time that happens, the more like enculturated I have become to, I start to care about it because that's what I'm surrounded by. And so I think the same is just as true when it comes to the home. If we want our children to have or experience God the way we have, or to follow Jesus the way we're hoping they will, so they can have the life that Jesus promises them, the best chance they have at that is that they can experience that through our living it out in front of them first and foremost. Because, I mean, as the cliche goes, right, more is caught than taught, or at least in terms of like sitting down and having like a lesson or something like that. Like the ins and outs of a kid seeing you live life with Jesus is going to have far more impact than just sitting them down to say like, these are the important things. And like, I did my spiel and it's up to them to kind of do what they want with it. Like that's not going to cut it. They need to see it day in, day out through all sorts of situations, good, bad, the whole thing. They need to see the holistic nature of what it looks like to follow Jesus, because following Jesus is a whole life thing. It's not just an add-on. It's either what your life is about or it's not. And ultimately, like life is about being connected to the life of God, and we get to do that in and through following Jesus. You have any follow-up or final thoughts?
No, I think that's good.
All right. We'll try to link at least a way for you to see this article if you want to see it. I have posted it on the Clarence Church of Christ social media accounts. You can probably see it there if you haven't already. But we'll try to link it in the notes if you want to take a look at it and read it for yourself, or have a link to just kind of reference it down the road if that's something that interests you. But thank you for joining us for this episode of the podcast, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.